Jonathan Larson wasn't just writing a musical, he was standing on the precipice of changing Broadway history forever. His work was a ticking time bomb, ready to explode. Tickets were sold out, the critics were buzzing, and a life-changing future was waiting in the wings. He had everything within reach: the talent, the fame, and the golden ticket to finally escape his dead-end life as a poor waiter. But the cruelest twist wasn't failure. It was vanishing right before the finish line. A chest pain dismissed by doctors, a fatal misdiagnosis, and it was all over. Jonathan collapsed alone on a cold kitchen floor the very night before the premiere. It is a brutal truth. He created a billion-dollar empire and a global phenomenon, but when the glory finally arrived, he was already gone. He died without seeing a single penny from the commercial success of his masterpiece. This is the story of Jonathan Larson and what remains when the music fades. Jonathan David Larson was born on February 4th, 1960, in Mount Vernon, New York, just as the conservative stability of the Eisenhower era was beginning to fracture into the chaotic, vibrant energy of the 1960s. He was not born into the starving artist garrets he would later romanticize in his work. He was a child of the suburbs, a product of the post-war American dream, raised in White Plains by Alan and Nanette Larson. It was a good, warm Jewish household. Alan was a sales executive, a man of quiet strength and integrity. Nanette was a woman of immense warmth and spirit. In an era where many parents steered their children toward the safety of law degrees, medical practices, or corporate ladders, the Larsons did something radical. They listened to who their son actually was. And from the very start, Jonathan was loud. Refusing to blend into the background, he possessed a kinetic energy that seemed too large for his small frame. The Larson household was filled with music, which Jonathan didn't just listen to, he consumed. He played the trumpet, he played the tuba, an instrument that, when wrapped around a young boy, looks almost comical, yet Jonathan played it with a seriousness that demanded attention. He sat at the piano, his fingers finding melodies that were sophisticated beyond his years. His sister, Julie, remembers a brother who was a whirlwind of creativity. He was the kind of child who didn't just enter a room. He announced himself. He organized backyard plays. He directed his friends. He turned the mundane suburban existence into a stage. He was a drama geek before the term was affectionate, a boy who found more truth in a cast recording of Fiddler on the Roof than in a baseball game. But beneath the noise and the bravado, there was a deep sensitivity. He absorbed the world around him. He grew up watching the cultural tectonic plates shift. He saw the folk music revival, the rise of rock and roll, the protests against Vietnam, and the dawn of the age of liberation. He was a sponge, soaking up the changing frequencies of America. He attended White Plains High School, where he wasn't an outcast, but he was certainly distinct. He was the star of the drama club, the kid who lived for the applause. At this stage in his life, the dream was singular and clear. Jonathan Larson was going to be an actor. He wanted to be the one in the spotlight, the vessel through which the emotions flowed. He didn't yet know that his true power lay not in speaking other people's lines, but in writing the lines that others would speak for decades to come. In the late 1970s, Jonathan packed his bags and headed to Adelphi University in Garden City, Long Island. He had won a 4-year acting scholarship, a validation of his talent and his ambition. Adelphi was a crucible. It was a place where serious young artists gathered to deconstruct the craft. For the first couple of years, Jonathan threw himself into acting. He studied the methods. He learned the discipline of the body and the voice. But as he moved through the curriculum, a subtle shift began to occur. The theater program at Adelphi was vibrant, filled with student cabarets and original productions. Jonathan, with his musical background, began to tinker. He started writing songs for these reviews. He wrote sketches. He composed small numbers for his friends to sing. It was during these late-night sessions in practice rooms, surrounded by sheet music and stale coffee, that Jonathan realized something profound. Acting was exhilarating, yes, but it was also incredibly vulnerable. As an actor, you are at the mercy of the script, the director, and the casting agent. You are a vehicle for someone else's vision. But writing was control. Writing was creation. When he sat at the piano and struck a chord, he wasn't waiting for permission. He was building a world. He realized that he could say more with a melody than he ever could with a monologue. He began to write incessantly. He wrote about what he knew: college life, relationships, the anxiety of the future. His style was eclectic, a collision of the classic Broadway show tunes he had been raised on and the rock and pop music that was dominating the radio. He loved Billy Joel. He loved Elton John. He loved The Who. He didn't see why there had to be a wall between the music of the street and the music of the stage. He graduated in 1982 with a Bachelor of Fine Arts. The degree was on paper, but his real education came from a correspondence that feels almost mythical in hindsight. Every young writer has an idol, a North Star they navigate by. For Jonathan Larson, that star was Stephen Sondheim. Sondheim was the titan of musical theater. He was the man who had written the lyrics for West Side Story and Gypsy, and had gone on to compose the complex, intellectual, and emotionally devastating scores of Company, Follies, and Sweeney Todd. Sondheim had intellectualized the musical. He had made it a serious art form capable of handling dark, complex themes. Jonathan didn't just admire Sondheim, he worshipped him. And in a display of the chutzpah that would define his career, Jonathan reached out to him. It is a testament to Stephen Sondheim's character that he responded. He didn't just send a form letter. He saw something in Jonathan's work. He saw a unique ear. Sondheim recognized that Jonathan understood the mathematical structure of a song, the way a lyric must sit on a melody, the way a rhyme must land to have impact. But he also saw that Jonathan was trying to bring a new sonic palette to the table. Sondheim took the young Larson under his wing. It wasn't a formal apprenticeship, but it was a lifeline. He reviewed Jonathan's material. He wrote letters of recommendation. He offered the kind of brutal, honest critique that only a master can give. In one particularly pivotal conversation, Sondheim gave Jonathan the advice that would alter the trajectory of his life. He told the young man, in essence, don't act, write. You have a voice, use it. It was the permission Jonathan needed. He put aside the headshots and the acting auditions. He committed himself to the pen. With his degree in hand and Sondheim's blessing in his pocket, Jonathan did what every dreamer has done since the invention of the city. He moved to Lower Manhattan. But we must pause here to adjust our mental image. If you visit Lower Manhattan today, you see slick condos, Whole Foods, million-dollar lofts, and tourists. You see a sterilized playground for the wealthy. That was not the New York of 1982. New York City in the early 1980s was a city on the ropes. It was gritty, it was dangerous, and it was falling apart. The city was still reeling from the fiscal crisis of the 1970s. Crime was high. The subways were covered in graffiti inside and out. Times Square was a sleazy wonderland of peep shows and crime, not the Disney-fied tourist trap it is now. But for an artist, it was paradise. Why? Because it was cheap. You could live in the East Village or Soho for a few $100s a month. It meant you could work a part-time job and spend the rest of your time creating. It created a density of artists, painters, sculptors, musicians, drag queens, playwrights, all living on top of each other, sharing resources, sharing heat, and sharing ideas. Jonathan found a loft on the 5th floor of a tumble-down building on Greenwich Street. It was, by all standard metrics, a disaster. The insulation was non-existent. The windows rattled in their frames. To take a bath, he had to fill a tub that was located, bizarrely, in the middle of the kitchen. The heating system was archaic and mostly broken. During the brutal New York winters, when the wind chill dropped below zero, the only source of warmth was a wood-burning stove. Jonathan had to scavenge for wood, hauling scraps of lumber and broken furniture up 5 flights of stairs just to keep from freezing. And yet, he loved it. He romanticized the struggle. He saw himself as part of a lineage of bohemians, like the characters in Puccini's La Bohème, who suffered for their art. He believed that the cold, the hunger, and the grime were necessary ingredients for authentic creation. He decorated the apartment with eclectic junk he found on the street. He had a futon, a clutter of books, and most importantly, his keyboard. This synthesized piano was his altar. It was where he spent hours every day, headphones on, pounding out the rhythms that he heard in his head. To survive, he took a job that would become legendary in his biography. He became a waiter at the Moondance Diner in Soho. The Moondance was a classic chrome and neon diner, a relic of a bygone era. It was a place where the menu was greasy, the coffee was strong, and the clientele was a mix of hungover artists, local workers, and tourists. For nearly 10 years, Jonathan Larson wore the apron. If you visited New York in the late 80s, you might have been served a burger by a man with wild hair and an intense, distracted stare, never knowing that he was mentally composing a complex counterpoint for a rock opera while pouring your coffee. He hated the job. He hated the servitude of it, the mind-numbing repetition. He felt, as many artists do, that he was wasting his potential, trading the precious hours of his life for tips, and yet he loved the humanity of it. The diner was a microcosm of the city. He heard the cadence of New York speech. He saw the breakups, the reunions, the lonely late-night eaters. He met people who would change his life, including Jesse L. Martin, a fellow waiter who would one day become a star in Jonathan's own show. This was the crucible. The years between 1982 and 1990 were years of grinding poverty and blinding ambition. Jonathan was poor, not daddy pays the rent poor, but genuinely struggling. He constantly worried about money. His dream was heartbreakingly simple. He just wanted enough money to afford cable TV. But amidst the poverty, there was a defiant joy. Jonathan became the center of a tribe. He hosted what he called the Peasants' Feast. He would scrape together money to buy huge amounts of pasta and cheap wine, and he would invite everyone he knew to the freezing loft. Dancers, actors, bohemians. They would huddle around the wood stove, eating, drinking, and arguing about art. At these parties, Jonathan would often stand on a piece of furniture, raise a glass, and make a proclamation that sounded insane to everyone but him. He would declare that he was going to change the face of American theater. Most people laughed. They loved him. They admired his passion, but they thought he was dreaming. Broadway was a closed fortress. Rock musicals were a dead genre. Who was this waiter to think he could tear down the walls? But Jonathan wasn't joking. He was deadly serious. Yet declarations made on tabletops require more than just wine and passion to become reality. They require a vessel. For Jonathan, that vessel was not going to be a traditional show tune or a safe revival. He was ready to channel all that manic energy, all the lessons from Sondheim, and the very noise of the city into a project that would consume his 20s. He didn't know it yet, but he was about to spend the next decade building a machine that would never fly, but whose construction would teach him exactly how to build the one that would. Throughout the bulk of the 1980s, Jonathan Larson was not just waiting tables. He was building a world. If you walked into his chaotic apartment during this era, you would find stacks of notebooks, cassette tapes, and sketches detailing a universe that existed only in his mind. He called it Superbia. It was meant to be his magnum opus. It was the project that would announce his arrival. Superbia was ambitious, perhaps to a fault. It was a futuristic musical satire set in the year 2064. The concept was heavily influenced by George Orwell's novel 1984, but filtered through the neon lens of the MTV generation. It depicted a world where emotions were outlawed, where humanity lived in a narcotized state inside a literal bubble, anticipating our modern obsession with screens and media fame. Jonathan wasn't just writing songs. He was writing a prophecy. He was critiquing the rise of reality television and the obsession with celebrity culture years before Survivor or Keeping Up with the Kardashians ever aired. He saw the way screens were beginning to mediate human connection, and it terrified him. He poured 7 years of his life into Superbia. 7 years of rewriting, composing, and scraping together money for demo tapes. He wrote the book, the music, and the lyrics, a triple threat task that is incredibly rare in musical theater, usually reserved for the likes of Noel Coward or his idol Sondheim. The industry noticed. Jonathan wasn't shouting into a void. People were listening. He won the prestigious Richard Rogers Production Award. He received grants from the Stephen Sondheim Award. He was invited to develop the show at the O'Neill Theater Center, a legendary testing ground for new plays. At the O'Neill, the response was a confusing mixture of awe and bewilderment. The industry professionals saw the talent. They heard the music, a jagged electric fusion of new wave, synth pop, and rock that sounded like nothing else on Broadway. But they didn't know what to do with it. "It's brilliant," they would say, "but it's not a musical. It's a rock concert." Then came the legal hammer. Jonathan had originally conceived the show as a direct adaptation of 1984. When he applied for the rights from the Orwell estate, they flatly refused. They didn't want a rock musical version of their dark classic. Jonathan was devastated. He had to strip the show of its Orwellian references, rewriting the entire plot to avoid a lawsuit. He kept pushing. He organized a workshop production at Playwrights Horizons. He invited every producer in town. He was certain that once they saw it, they would understand. They came, they watched, and they passed. The feedback was a chorus of almost. It's too expensive to produce. The set requirements are too high. It's too weird for Broadway, but too commercial for off-Broadway. We don't think a rock score works in a theater. After nearly a decade of labor, Superbia was dead. It was a masterpiece with nowhere to go. The failure of Superbia broke something in Jonathan. It wasn't just a professional setback. It was an existential crisis. He was approaching his 30th birthday. In the timeline of a normal life, 30 is young. But in the timeline of a dreamer, 30 is a cliff edge. He looked around and saw his friends, the ones he had acted with in college, the ones he had started out with in the village, beginning to grow up. They were trading in their headshots for business cards. They were getting jobs in marketing and advertising and real estate. They were moving out of the freezing lofts and into heated apartments in Brooklyn or the suburbs. They were buying cars. They were having children. They were selling out. Or perhaps they were just surviving. Jonathan felt left behind. He was still at the Moondance Diner. He was still wearing the apron. He was still living in a cold apartment with a bathtub in the kitchen. He had no health insurance, no savings, and his greatest work had just been rejected. He began to hear a sound, a rhythmic, incessant ticking. This wasn't a hallucination, it was a manifestation of his anxiety. He felt that he was running out of time. Most people assume they have decades to make their mark. Jonathan seemed to possess a subconscious knowledge that his timeline was shorter than everyone else's. He became obsessed with the idea of legacy. "What have I done?" he would ask. "What will I leave behind?" He began to suffer from chest pains and dizziness, early warning signs that were dismissed as stress, but which we now know were likely symptoms of his undiagnosed condition. The body was warning him, and the mind translated it into a frantic need to create. Out of the ashes of Superbia and the panic of turning 30, Jonathan did the only thing he knew how to do. He wrote about it. He stopped trying to invent futuristic worlds. He stopped trying to write about rock stars and bubbles. He looked in the mirror and wrote about the man staring back. He began writing a rock monologue. Initially, he called it 30/90, turning 30 in 1990. Later, he retitled it Boho Days. Finally, he settled on the name that perfectly captured the sound in his head: tick, tick, boom. This was a radical departure from Superbia. It was small, it was intimate, it was designed to be performed by one man, Jonathan, a piano, and a rock band. In Tick, Tick, Boom, Jonathan plays a character named John. John is a composer waiting tables. John is trying to write a musical called Superbia, ironically referenced. John is watching his best friend Michael give up acting to join a corporate advertising firm. John is watching his girlfriend Susan ask him to move to Cape Cod and open a dance studio. The show is a raw nerve. It is a document of artistic anxiety. In songs like Why and Louder Than Words, Jonathan asks the questions that every artist asks in the dark of night. Is this worth it? Am I delusional? Should I just give up and be comfortable? He performed the show himself at small venues, like the Second Stage Theater and the Village Gate. It was a revelation. Audiences who had been confused by the sci-fi complexity of Superbia instantly connected with the raw vulnerability of tick, tick, boom. They saw a man bleeding on stage, singing about the fear of failure with a rock and roll voice. It was during these performances that Jonathan found his true voice. He realized that he didn't need to hide behind high-concept metaphors. The most powerful story he could tell was the story of his own community, the struggles, the choices, and the love that bound them together. While Jonathan was wrestling with his internal demons, the world outside his window was transforming into a nightmare. By the early 1990s, the East Village was no longer just a bohemian playground. It was a war zone. The HIV/AIDS epidemic was tearing through New York City with the ferocity of a plague. It is difficult to convey to a modern audience the sheer terror of that time. There were no cocktails to manage the disease. A diagnosis was a death sentence, often swift and agonizing. Jonathan was straight, but his world was not. His community, the theater world, the waiters, the dancers, was disproportionately affected. He began to lose friends. He would see a regular customer at the diner one week looking healthy, and here they were gone the next. He went to memorial services for men who were 25, 28, 30 years old. He saw the way society treated them. He saw the fear, the stigma, the families who disowned their dying sons. He saw the government's indifference. He also saw the tent cities in Tompkins Square Park, homeless encampments filled with people, many suffering from AIDS, who had been pushed out of their homes by gentrification and medical bills. He saw the riots as the police tried to clear the park. Jonathan's severe romanticism began to harden into something sharper. He felt a responsibility. He realized that his art couldn't just be about him and his career anxieties. It had to be about this. It had to be about the bodies piling up. It had to be about the people disappearing from the streets. He wanted to write something that mattered. He wanted to write something that would force the world to look at what was happening in the East Village. In 1989, a playwright named Billy Aronson had an idea. He loved Puccini's 1896 opera, La Bohème, a story about impoverished artists living in Paris in the 1840s. The characters freeze in garrets, burn their manuscripts for warmth, and deal with the scourge of tuberculosis. Aronson thought, this is New York right now. He wanted to update the opera. He wanted to set it in the modern day. He wanted to replace Paris with the East Village. He wanted to replace tuberculosis with AIDS. Aronson was a playwright, not a composer. He needed someone who could write the music. A mutual friend suggested Jonathan Larson. They met. Aronson pitched the idea. Jonathan's eyes lit up. It was the perfect vessel for everything he was feeling. It was the collision of the classical structure he learned from Sondheim and the gritty reality he lived every day. They began to collaborate. They wrote a few songs, including an early version of Santa Fe and I Should Tell You. But the partnership was difficult. Aronson's vision was more satirical, a bit more detached. Jonathan's vision was intensely emotional and personal. He didn't want to write a parody of La Bohème. He wanted to write the La Bohème of his generation. Eventually, they came to an amicable agreement. Jonathan asked if he could take the concept and run with it on his own. Aronson agreed. Jonathan was now alone with the project. He looked at the characters of the opera and began to rename them. Rodolfo the poet became Roger the songwriter. Marcello the painter became Mark the filmmaker. Mimi the seamstress became Mimi the exotic dancer. Musetta became Maureen. He sat down at his keyboard in the freezing loft. He looked out the window at the fire escapes and the gray sky. He thought about his friends who had died. He thought about the wood stove he had to feed to stay warm. He thought about the no he had heard for 15 years. He placed his hands on the keys. He wasn't writing Superbia anymore. He wasn't writing tick, tick, boom. He typed a new title on the cover page, a 4-letter word that meant payment for living and torn apart. He typed R-E-N-T. But a title is not a show, and an idea is not a script. Typing those 4 letters was merely the lighting of the fuse. The explosion would take another 7 years to engineer. Jonathan had found his subject matter, but now he faced the monumental task of wrestling it onto the page. He had to take the chaotic, tragic, vibrant reality of the East Village and structure it into a narrative that could sing. The severe romantic was about to enter his most grueling period of creation, where he would have to balance the technical precision of a composer with the raw grief of a survivor. Creating a Broadway musical is often compared to birthing an elephant. The gestation period is impossibly long, and the process is agonizing. Rent was no exception. It was not written in a fever dream of a few weeks. It was sculpted, chipped away at, and polished over 7 grueling years. Between 1989 and 1995, Jonathan Larson lived inside this script. He carried notebooks everywhere. While working the brunch shift at the Moondance Diner, wiping down tables covered in syrup and ketchup, he was mentally refining the lyrics to One Song Glory. When he was riding his bike through the perilous traffic of Manhattan, he was working out the syncopation of La Vie Bohème. He was a perfectionist. He wrote hundreds of songs for Rent, only to cut them, rewrite them, or throw them away entirely. He wanted the show to feel like a collage of New York sounds. He wanted the rough edge of grunge, the soul of gospel, the bounce of R&B, and the narrative drive of Sondheim. Crucially, he began to populate the script with the ghosts and the living souls of his own life. The character of Mark Cohen, the filmmaker who observes life through a lens, rather than living it, was clearly Jonathan himself. Mark's sweater was Jonathan's sweater. Mark's inability to sell out was Jonathan's stubbornness. The character of Tom Collins, the philosophy professor and anarchist, was based partly on men he knew, but the role was destined for his friend and fellow waiter, Jesse L. Martin. The support group scene, life support, where characters sit in a circle and chant, "Will I lose my dignity?" was not fiction. Jonathan attended Friends Indeed meetings. He sat in the back of rooms filled with men and women fighting AIDS. He listened to their fears. He promised them he would tell their story without pity, but with honor. As the script evolved, Jonathan made a decision that would define the soul of the show. It was a decision that separated him from his source material, Puccini's La Bohème. In the opera, the heroine Mimi dies of tuberculosis in the final scene. It is a classic tragedy. The curtain falls on a corpse and a weeping lover. It is beautiful, but it is final. Jonathan looked at his own version of Mimi, a 19-year-old HIV-positive dancer struggling with heroin addiction. He looked at his Roger, a recovering addict terrified of attaching to anyone. He wrote the death scene. He wrote the moment Mimi's hand goes cold. The music swells. Roger cries out his name. The audience prepares for the inevitable darkness. But Jonathan couldn't do it. He was, by his own admission, a severe romantic. He looked around at the devastation of the AIDS crisis in the 1990s. There was enough death. There were enough funerals. He felt that art had a moral obligation to offer something else, hope. So he changed the ending. In Rent, Mimi drifts toward death, sees a light, and then she comes back. She wakes up. She tells Roger, "I was heading toward a warm white light, and I swear Angel was there." And she said, "Turn around, girlfriend. You have to listen to that boy's song." Critics would later call this moment melodrama. They would call it unrealistic. But Jonathan didn't care about realism. He cared about emotional truth. He wanted to say that love is a force powerful enough to pull you back from the brink. He wanted to give his friends in the audience the survival story they weren't getting in real life. By 1993, the show caught the eye of James Nicola, the artistic director of the New York Theater Workshop, NYTW. It was a small, gritty theater on East 4th Street, right in the heart of the neighborhood Jonathan was writing about. It was the perfect home, but the show was a mess. It was too long. The plot was tangled. The characters were screaming over each other. For 3 years, Jonathan worked with director Michael Grafe and dramaturge Lynn Thompson. They argued. They fought. Jonathan was fiercely protective of his work. He refused to cut songs he loved. He refused to simplify the complex counterpoint. He was a nightmare to work with and a dream. He was fighting for every note because he felt the clock ticking louder than ever. Then came the casting. This was 1995. They didn't want polished Broadway veterans with perfect vibrato and shiny teeth. They wanted grit. They wanted people who looked like they actually lived in the East Village. They found a tribe of unknowns who would become legends. Adam Pascal, a rock singer with no theater experience, who auditioned on a whim because he needed money. Anthony Rapp, a distinct, intense young actor who embodied the nervous energy of Mark. Idina Menzel, a wedding singer from Long Island with a voice of terrifying power, cast as the performance artist, Maureen. Wilson Germain Heredia, who transformed into the drag queen Angel with a grace that broke everyone's heart. When this group got into the room together, the chemistry was volatile and electric. They weren't just rehearsing a play, they were forming a family. Jonathan watched them from the back of the room, scribbling notes, beaming. He finally saw his vision breathing. It is October 1995. Jonathan quits his job at the Moondance Diner. He tells his boss, "I'm done, my show is going up." It was the moment he had waited 15 years for. But as the rehearsals for the off-Broadway premiere intensified in January 1996, a shadow fell over Jonathan. This is the part of the story that induces a helpless rage in anyone who reads it. The week of the premiere, The technical rehearsals were grueling. 12-hour days, 14-hour days. The theater was dusty and stressful. Jonathan began to feel sick. He had intense chest pains. He felt dizzy. He had shortness of breath. On January 21st, during a rehearsal, he collapsed. He couldn't stand up. He did the responsible thing. He went to the emergency room at Cabrini Medical Center. The doctors examined him. They saw a young man in ragged clothes. They heard he was a theater artist working on a stressful show. They saw the chaos of his life. They made a snap judgment. They diagnosed him with food poisoning. They pumped his stomach, a brutal and unnecessary procedure, and sent him home. The pain didn't stop. It migrated. It felt like something was tearing inside his back. 2 days later, he went to a different hospital, St. Vincent's. He told them his chest hurt. He told them he couldn't breathe properly. The doctors performed an X-ray and an EKG, but in a tragic oversight, they failed to identify the crucial sign. They looked at him and saw a bohemian. They assumed he was on drugs or perhaps just suffering from the flu or extreme stress. They told him, "You have a virus. Go home. Rest." They missed the ticking bomb. Jonathan Larson had undiagnosed Marfan syndrome, a genetic disorder that affects the body's connective tissue. People with Marfan are often tall and thin, with long fingers, exactly like Jonathan. The most dangerous aspect of Marfan is that it weakens the aorta, the massive artery that carries blood from the heart to the rest of the body. Jonathan's aorta was slowly expanding. It was dissecting, tearing apart. If the doctors had done a CT scan, they would have seen it. They could have rushed him into surgery. It was operable. He could have been saved. But they didn't look. They sent him home to his unheated apartment. It is January 24th, 1996, the day of the final dress rehearsal, the day before the first public preview. Jonathan is weak, looking pale and fragile, but his spirit is soaring. He sits in the back of the New York Theater workshop. The house is packed with industry people, friends, and family. The lights go down. The band strikes the first chord of Rent. The cast explodes onto the stage. For 2.5 hours, Jonathan watches his life play out. He sees the struggles, the drugs, the death, and the defiance. He hears the applause, not polite applause, but raucous, foot-stomping cheers. During the intermission, a reporter from the New York Times, Anthony Tomasini, interviews him. Jonathan is sitting on a lobby bench, vibrating with energy. He says the words that will become his epitaph. "I think I may have finally written a show that people will like." After the show, the cast gathers on stage. They are high on adrenaline. Jonathan comes down to speak to them. He gives them notes. He tells them they were wonderful. He smiles that wide, goofy smile. He tells them, "Go home, rest. We have a big day tomorrow." He leaves the theater. He walks out into the freezing January night. He goes home to Greenwich Street. He climbs the 5 flights of stairs to his loft. It is 3 a.m. on January 25th. The city is quiet. He is alone. He is tired, but it is a good tired. He is thinking about the reviews. He is thinking about the future. He is thinking about the fact that he never has to pour another cup of coffee for a stranger again. He walks into the kitchen. He is cold. He fills the kettle with water. He puts it on the stove. He turns the dial. The blue flame ignites. He waits for the whistle, and then the clock stops. The weakened wall of his aorta finally gives way. It is a massive rupture. Jonathan Larson collapses on the kitchen floor. There is no time for a final word. There is no time to say goodbye. There is no time to write one last song. The kettle begins to boil. The steam rises into the cold air. The whistle blows, piercing the silence of the apartment, calling for a man who can no longer hear it. He was 35 years old, 10 days before his 36th birthday. The sun rises on January 25th. It is a cold, crisp morning. The cast of Rent is waking up, drinking coffee, warming up their voices. They are nervous, Tonight is the night, the first preview. The critics are coming. At the apartment, Jonathan's roommate, Brian, comes home. He finds Jonathan on the floor. He calls 911, but he knows it is too late. The police arrive, the coroner arrives. The news begins to travel. It moves through phone lines, from the police to the family, from the family to the theater. James Nicola, the artistic director, receives the call. He freezes. It is impossible. It is a mistake. He just saw him. He was just laughing. Nicola has to tell the cast. They are gathering at the theater for sound check. They are laughing, joking, stretching. Nicola walks onto the stage. His face is gray. The room goes silent. Jonathan died last night. The sound that follows is not a scream. It is a collective intake of breath, a vacuum, as if the air has been sucked out of the universe. They fall to the floor. They hold each other. Idina Menzel is sobbing. Anthony Rapp is staring at the wall. The producer, Jeffrey Seller, arrives. The question hangs in the air, heavy and suffocating. What do we do? The show is supposed to open in 4 hours. There's a line of people outside the box office waiting for tickets. We can't do the show, someone says. We can't sing these songs. Not tonight. But we can't send people home, someone else argues. Jonathan invited them. His friends are coming. His family is coming. They make a decision. They will cancel the performance, but they will open the doors. They will invite Jonathan's family and friends into the theater. The cast will sit on stage, on folding chairs, behind music stands. No costumes, no dancing, no acting. They will simply sing the score. A memorial concert, a requiem for the man who wrote the notes. 7 p.m. The theater is packed. The air is thick with grief. You can hear the weeping before the lights even go down. Alan and Nanette Larson are there, sitting in the center, their faces masks of shock. The cast walks out. They look like children who have lost a parent. They sit on the metal chairs. They begin to sing Tune Up. At first it is quiet, subdued. They are choking back tears. They are struggling to get the words out. But then the music takes over. This music, this loud, angry, joyous rock and roll music was not built for sitting down. It was not built for mourning. It was built for living. By the time they reach La Vie Bohème, the anthem of the show, a toast to days of inspiration, playing hooky, making something out of nothing, the cast can't sit anymore. One by one, they kick away the chairs. They stand up. They jump on the tables. They scream the lyrics. They dance with a ferocity that feels like an exorcism. They are singing to him. They are singing to the empty spot in the back of the room where he should have been standing. And the audience? The audience is transformed. They aren't watching a show anymore. They are witnessing a resurrection. When the final note of the finale plays, "No day but today," there is a silence that lasts for a heartbeat. And then a voice from the back of the theater shouts, "Thank you, Jonathan Larson." The applause is not polite. It is a roar. It is a primal scream of gratitude and loss. It goes on for minutes. It goes on for years. That single night of mourning could have been the end of the story. A brilliant flash of what might have been, remembered only by a few hundred people in a downtown theater. But the energy generated in that room was too volatile to be contained. The applause that began at the memorial concert rippled outward, growing louder and more intense with every passing day. As the shock of Jonathan's death began to settle into a dull ache, a new reality emerged. The show he had died for was not just surviving without him, it was becoming a monster. The silence of his final night was about to be drowned out by the deafening roar of fame. In the days following Jonathan Larson's death, the New York Theater Workshop ceased to be a mere off-Broadway venue. It became a shrine. The sidewalk outside on East 4th Street was carpeted in flowers, candles, and notes, scrawled by strangers who had never met Jonathan, but felt they knew him. The show, rent opened as scheduled. But without its creator there to guide it, the production took on a mythical quality. The reviews were not just positive, they were reverent. The New York Times called it an exhilarating landmark rock opera. Variety hailed it as the show that would save the musical. But the true verdict didn't come from the critics. It came from the street. Almost immediately, a phenomenon occurred that Broadway had never seen before. Young people, teenagers, college students, the bohemians Jonathan wrote about, began camping out on the sidewalk. They brought sleeping bags, thermoses, and guitars. They waited for hours, sometimes days, for the chance to buy a $20 ticket in the front 2 rows. They called themselves rent heads. For decades, Broadway had been the playground of the wealthy and the elderly. Tickets were expensive. The dress code was rigid. Jonathan Larson had wanted to smash that barrier. He wanted his friends, the ones who couldn't afford a $100 seat, to see his show. The producers honored this wish by instituting the rush ticket policy, a tradition that continues on Broadway to this day. The demand was too high for the small off-Broadway theater. A bidding war erupted. Every major producer wanted a piece of the show that had captured the zeitgeist. On April 29, 1996, just 3 months after Jonathan's death, Rent moved to Broadway. It took up residence at the Nederlander Theater on 41st Street. When the curtain rose on opening night on Broadway, the seat that Jonathan would have occupied was left empty. Then came the awards season. This was the moment where the tragedy solidified into history. Rent won the Pulitzer Prize for Drama. It won the Drama Desk Awards. It won the Obie Awards. And finally, it won 4 Tony Awards, including Best Musical. Watching the ceremony was a surreal experience as Alan and Nanette Larson walked up the stairs to the podium to accept the awards for their son. Julie Larson, his sister, spoke for the family. It's a bittersweet moment because Jonathan isn't here to share it, but his spirit is in Rent, and now Rent belongs to the world. While the world was celebrating the art, a darker battle was being fought in the courts. The Larson family launched an investigation into his death. The New York State Health Department found that Jonathan had presented classic symptoms of aortic dissection, but the hospitals had failed to diagnose him properly, attributing his condition to food poisoning or a virus. The state fined the hospitals, and the family filed a malpractice lawsuit to put on public record that Jonathan did not have to die. With the settlement money and the royalties from Rent, the family established the Jonathan Larson Performing Arts Foundation. The mission was simple: to provide cash grants to struggling composers to buy them time to write. One of the recipients was a young Lin-Manuel Miranda, who would later say that the grant was crucial validation before he wrote Hamilton. While the stage production secured Jonathan's place in theatrical history, his revolution had one frontier left to cross: the screen. In 2005, Hollywood finally adapted Rent. Directed by Chris Columbus and featuring most of the original Broadway cast, the film served as a time capsule, capturing the specific alchemy of the 1996 workshop in amber. While critics debated the adaptation, the film succeeded in bringing the message of No Day But Today to millions who could never afford a Broadway ticket, globalizing the congregation of rent heads. But the true resurrection arrived in 2021 with the film adaptation of Tick, Tick, Boom, directed by Lin-Manuel Miranda. Miranda, who had been inspired by Rent as a teenager to write Hamilton, cast Andrew Garfield to play Jonathan. Garfield didn't just act, he channeled the composer's manic energy and desperation, revealing the human being behind the legend. The film visualized the agony and ecstasy of the creative process, transforming Jonathan from a tragic figure into a relatable, brilliant human being. The film sparked a digital renaissance. A new generation on TikTok and YouTube began dissecting Larson's lyrics, relating deeply to his anxiety about time and economic survival. The lost works surfaced, and the world finally heard the full breadth of his genius. Not just the rock composer, but the jazz composer, the folk writer, and the satirist. Jonathan Larson's biological life was a tragedy of timing. He was the runner who collapsed inches before the finish line. But his metaphysical life is a triumph. He wrote about isolation before the internet disconnected us. He wrote about a virus before the world was shut down by a pandemic. He wrote about the need for community in a fractured world. He taught us that the only way to defeat death is to create something that screams life. He left us with a silence in the kitchen, yes, but he filled the rest of the world with a song that will never stop playing. Thank you, Jonathan Larson.